Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate. Just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
My girlfriend, she came to me with a list of all the celebrities she thinks she should be able to hook up with if she ever got the chance. And this upset me a lot, but then she said I could have my own list. So I just copied hers exactly. So that way if we ever run into John Mayer, I can be like, hold on you guys, I'm coming as well, because he's also on my list. Right? It's important to do things together as a couple so you have shared experiences to tell your grandchildren.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Bad News Thursday, October the 10th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and bad news. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now the headlines for October the 10th. Chase suspect drives onto curb, crashes into fence and car. Video shows DUI suspect veer off road in Orange County crash that killed woman. 13 dead after Milton hits Florida as Cat 3 hurricane. Sea lion fatally shot on Orange County beach. Daunting costs and challenges to plug Los Angeles County's zombie wells. Taunting letter challenges California news station to help hackers victim. Car crashes into Southgate Bakery days after it opened. Disneyland raises ticket prices. Magic key passes. Adult son arrested in mobile home fire that killed Pomona man. Clean talk trend may increase child poisoning risk, experts say. 1-month-old girl dies after being bitten by dog in Torrance. Social Security recipients will get 2.5% cost of living boost in 2025. And that was the headlines for October 10th. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the election corner.
Fuck Kamala Harris. Fuck Kamala Harris. What she do the last 4 years? This bitch should be embarrassed. Fuck Kamala Harris. Fuck Kamala Harris. Left the borders wide open for the criminals and terrorists. Mainstream news station twisting up the narrative. Pandering to black people, switching up her heritage. She laughing at the state of our country like it's hilarious. America's time to let them hear it. All together saying fuck Kamala Harris. Hi Kamala, bye Kamala. We don't want you, bitch. Like Obama, we don't like Obama or his husband Mitch. Big Mike on that Ellen show, we know that was a dick. And this the best country in the world. Stop trying to fuck with this. No hiding from the lies you helped destroy beside Biden. Inflated gas prices, food rent, we can't provide it. Can't fix the problem when you is the problem.
And that was the election corner. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Patriotic Short.
This photo captures an amazing moment. The crew of the USS Spencer rescuing German sailors from the U-175 submarine. Imagine, these American soldiers had just destroyed their submarine, sending it to the bottom of the ocean. And now they are risking their own lives to pull the enemy submariners out of the icy water, fighting the raging waves. Of the submarine's 54 crew members, 13 died, but 41 were rescued. The rescued submariners were not just helped, they were welcomed as their own. They were given dry clothes, wrapped in blankets, offered hot coffee, brandy, and cigarettes. All the things that American sailors themselves were often deprived of in war conditions. After the submariners were warmed up, they were fed a hot meal prepared on board. The American sailors showed not just concern, but an almost brotherly attitude, despite the fact that not long ago, these men had been their enemies in mortal combat.
And that was the Patriotic Short. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, a little bit of motivation. About 4 minutes.
Everybody wants to be a beast. Everybody wants to be number one. Everybody wants to be the best. Everybody wants to succeed. Everybody wants to have, to be, and do what they feel they've been called to do. The challenge becomes that most of us, when it's time to do what beasts do, we don't do it. So, E.T., what do you mean? Look, I told you, I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I just woke up recently and it was 2:45. And the average person in me said, E.T., just pull the covers back over you. It's okay. You got 15 minutes. But the phenomenal in me said, E.T., if you go back to sleep for those 15 minutes, there's no guarantee you're going to get up at 3 o'clock. If you go back to sleep right now, you might wake up and it's 4 o'clock. You might wake up and it's 5 o'clock. You might wake up and it's 6 o'clock. All you have is right now. Are those 15 minutes that sweet that you're going to push back your dream, that you're going to push back your goal. Everything you've ever wanted, son, you're right there. You're so close. You're closer than you've ever been before. Those 15 minutes are not worth the rest of your life. Those 15 minutes are not worth you slipping down the chart. That is not worth it because you wake up at 3:30. Some other kid's getting up at 3 and he's got 30 minutes on you today. So I need you not only to want to be a beast, I need you to get in beast mode and stay in beast mode. I need you to put on beast mode. I need you to live in beast mode. Everybody's got a dream. Everybody's got a goal. Everybody wants something in life. But many of you in this room right now, your beast mode is idle. Your beast mode is not turned on. And when you leave this place, I'm telling you, your life is going to go to a whole other level if you can learn to turn that switch on and keep that switch on.
When you want to become a diamond, your whole attitude change, your whole mindset, your thinking, your relationships, the decisions that you make, how you spend your time, your energy, all of it changes. See, this is something that you can't be in this business. This business has to be in you.
Continue to work, continue that course, believing in the worthy cause, the end state of it all, knowing that the pressures and the problems coming are welcoming. Those are the situations that are going to formulate and mold you into the person you want to be. Accept this as the reality. Sacrifice this day for the investment in the future, greatness.
So I'm telling you, in life, you start running from a class, you start running from a subject that you don't like, it will haunt you for the rest of your natural life. It ain't going nowhere. You gotta take that thing out, like, you gotta take the breath out. So some of y'all are afraid of math. Go after it. Go get it. Don't run from it no more. Go get it. You go in there and go get that grade. You go in there and get that information so you can pass that class. You gotta go get it. I want you to go in confidence that you've never had before. And every giant in your life, slay him. You go back and slay him. Don't kill him, slay him. I'm tired of people talking about, I want to be successful. I'm tired of people saying, I want to be great. Look, everybody wants to be a beast until it's time to do what real beasts do. And let me tell you something, that means getting up early and going to bed late. That means you don't go to sleep when you're tired. You go when you're done. So remember, success is never on discount, and greatness ain't never on sale. I challenge you to have more. I challenge you to do more. I challenge you to be more. You gotta get this beast mode. You gotta embody beast mode. Everything about you has to say, I ain't playing. If it's to have, I'm gonna get it. And I ain't leaving none of it behind. It's mine. Beast mode.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. God, grant me this. Thank you. And now about 5 minutes of meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
Pay what things are worth. Diogenes of Sinope said, "We'll sell things of great value for things of very little, and vice versa." Diogenes Laertius, Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, 6.2.35b. You can buy a plume blanche diamond-encrusted sofa for close to $200,000. It's also possible to hire one person to kill another person for $500. Remember that next time you hear someone ramble on about how the market decides what things are worth. The market might be rational, but the people who comprise it are not. Diogenes, who founded the Cynic school, emphasized the true worth, axia, of things, a theme that persisted in Stoicism and was strongly reflected in both Epictetus and Marcus. It's easy to lose track. When the people around you dump a fortune into trinkets they can't take with them when they die, it might seem like a good investment for you to make too. But of course it isn't. The good things in life cost what they cost. The unnecessary things are not worth it at any price. The key.
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Look, everybody, woe to the church if it doesn't pray. Then our evangelization becomes rationalistic, our service becomes social work. Woe to the church if it does not serve. It doesn't serve the poor, then our worship of God becomes an abstraction. Then evangelization is just a show. And woe to the church if it does not evangelize. If we think that somehow, being of service to the poor, that's enough. No. It's indispensable, but it's not enough. It's all three of these. The church prays. The church serves the poor. The church evangelizes. From Mark chapter 1 all the way up to the present day.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, if you want me to name in one sentence what is wrong with the modern world, I will say that never before has the world been clamoring so desperately for answers to crucial problems, and never before has the world been so frantically committed to the belief that no answers are possible. Unquote. That was Ayn Rand. Faith and Force, the Destroyers of the Modern World. From Philosophy, Who Needs It? Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Stuart Varney.
Sure, you do that.
All right, the opening bell about 30 minutes away, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average right now showing a decline of almost 100. Let's send it right over to Stu. Varney & Company begins right now. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria, and good morning, everyone. The sun is up, and we have eyes on the aftermath of Milton, and the news is in on inflation. It has ticked up, just picked up a tick. First, though, Milton. It's now moved into the Atlantic as a Cat 1 storm. It has left behind widespread flooding that stretches from the Gulf Coast to Orlando. 3.3 million without power at this time. You will see dramatic video of rescues and of those tornadoes. Next, the inflation story. The consumer price index moved up 2.4% over the past year. That is a little warmer than expected. Same with the month-over-month number, up 0.4%. I think it was 0.4, actually. No, I'm sorry. The graphic is correct. Up 0.2%. That is a little stronger than expected. Now, this affects the Federal Reserve's interest rate strategy, and so does the jobless claims number, much higher, 258,000. All right, here's the market reaction to all of this. On the downside, the Dow off maybe 100 points, the Nasdaq also off maybe 100 points. A limited reaction to those inflation numbers. Interest rates, the 10-year Treasury just over 4%. You're at 4.07 now and rising a little. Higher inflation, that's doing the trick there. The 10-year Treasury yield going up. The 2-year, though, at one point, just a moment ago, that was below 4%, is now at 3.99. Bitcoin, $60,000 and change, $60,800 a coin, I got it. Oil, $73 a barrel. No, $74 a barrel. It went up in the last half hour. Gas up 1 cent at $3.21. Diesel up 1 cent at $3.61. Gold still just above $2,600 an ounce, $26.37 to be precise. On the show today, the battle over disinformation. The president seemed to lose his temper. He accuses Donald Trump of lying about the administration's hurricane response. The question is, when does criticism become disinformation? We'll take you all across Florida, listening to the experience of those who lived through the worst of Milton. Trump floats a new tax cut. He wants to abolish the tax on Americans working overseas. We will contrast Trump's tax cuts with Kamala Harris's tax hikes. And the robo-taxi, revealed today. Elon Musk is everywhere, campaigning with Trump, bringing his Starlink to remote disaster areas, and now showcasing Tesla's future. Where does he get his energy? It's Thursday, October 10th, 2024.
And that was the Bloody Tourist, Nonprofit News Now. Thank you. And if you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because psychological internalization is one of the central topological shifts of violence in modernity. Violence occurs in the form of a conflict within the psyche. Destructive tensions are born internally rather than discharged externally. The front is no longer located outside the ego, but within it. Civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it like a garrison in a conquered city. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 10 of Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy.
Chapter 10, Case Studies. On a Saturday morning in the fall of 2000, the New York Times arrived at the home of Dr. Aaron Grossman, an Orthodox Jewish ophthalmologist living in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Chicago. Reading through the paper as he does every morning, Dr. Grossman saw a horrifying photo of a young man disoriented and covered in blood. A soldier loomed over him, screaming and holding a club. An Israeli policeman and a wounded Palestinian on the Temple Mount, read the caption. Poor Palestinian kid, Grossman thought to himself as he turned the page. He does not look good. But it would not be the last time he would see the photo. After Shabbat ended, Grossman's brother-in-law called, asking if Grossman had seen his son, Tuvia, in the paper. In fact, the young man in the photo, mistakenly described as Palestinian, was Grossman's son. The Friday before, a few hours before Shabbat began, Tuvia had been in a cab heading to the Wailing Wall to pray. The driver took a shortcut through an Arab neighborhood where a crowd of Palestinians swarmed them, dragging Tuvia from the car and beating him with fists, rocks, and knives to within an inch of his life. Certain he was about to die, Tuvia gathered what he believed was his final breath to recite the Shema, the holiest prayer in Judaism. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad, he cried as loud as he could. Hear, O Israel, God is your Lord, God is one. As he completed the prayer, he managed to drag himself off the rocky pavement and stumble toward a nearby gas station, the mob following close behind. Amazingly, an Israeli border patrol officer, an Arab-Israeli Druze named Gidon Safadi, who was stationed nearby, saw Tuvia approaching. Safadi ran to defend the young man, and a photo was snapped while the Druze border patrol officer was screaming at the crowd to back away. Far from beating Tuvia, Safadi had saved his life. The Times' caption portrayed a Jewish perpetrator and a Palestinian victim. The truth was the exact opposite, a Jewish victim and a Druze savior. The mistake was prescient. Though back in 2000, woke culture hadn't yet suffused the Times, when it comes to the Jews, the paper has always been woke. For if wokeness is the re-racialization of society into a crude binary, where power is a one-way street and one racial group uses it to oppress and dominate another, the left has long cast Jews in the role of oppressor, proximate to whiteness, if not worse. But Jews are not the only ones who have been treated this way. This chapter will explore 3 areas that the mainstream media has flubbed, blinded by a woke worldview. We will look at how Jews have been covered, how crime has been covered, or not covered, and how Trump's voters were covered, both his minority supporters and his white ones. In each case, the binary pushed by a national liberal news media enthralled to critical race theory has obscured the truth of the situation to a disastrous and ruinous degree. Jews. The erasure of Jews from mainstream media began long before the woke revolution. When it comes to the New York Times, for example, this omission is baked into the paper's DNA. Adolf Ochs, the Times' second owner and father of the Sulzberger dynasty that still owns it, was deeply insecure about his Jewishness, a facet of his personality that had no small influence on the Times' staid character in its early years. Ochs' discomfort around his Jewishness filtered down to the content as well as the tone of the paper. The Times, for example, opposed the Zionists in the early 20th century, which reflected both Ochs' own personal view and the paper's editorial policy. Ochs would get anti-Semitic hate mail, which often referred to the Times as a Jewish newspaper, something he could not abide. In response, in 1915, he told the city editor not to give too much space to the American Jewish Committee's call to help Jews in European war zones. "I don't approve of it," Ox said. "They work to preserve the characteristics and traditions of the Jew, making him a man apart from other men, and then complain that he is treated differently from other men. I'm interested in the Jewish religion. I want to see that preserved. But that's as far as I want to go." This point of view continued into the next generation, even as the pressure on Jews in Europe was intensifying. As Gay Talese writes in The Kingdom and the Power, when Arthur Hayes Sulzberger became publisher of The Times, he made speeches and statements urging Jews not to agitate for a Jewish-Palestinian state. And in 1939, Sulzberger was among a group of influential Jews who urged President Roosevelt not to appoint Felix Frankfurter to the Supreme Court because they believed that it would intensify anti-Semitism in America, a notion that Roosevelt resented and ignored. Even within the paper's management, there was anti-Semitism. The establishment of a correspondent to cover Jewish activities in America was specifically designed with the aim of keeping the New York Zionists off Sulzberger's back, an editor told Talese. Moreover, it was crucial, first to Ox and then to Sulzberger, that the paper not be seen as a Jewish paper. The Times more or less barred Jews from being foreign correspondents. Sulzberger believed that Jewish correspondents would embarrass them. Jews were routinely passed over for promotions at the paper, even after they had been promised them. "It's a family enterprise and it's a Jewish paper and we have a number of Jewish reporters working for us. But in all the years I've been here, we have never put a Jew in this showcase," Sulzberger bragged in 1937, the year the Jews had their citizenship revoked in Nazi Germany. One Jewish editor who had been passed over for the editorial page editor position because he was Jewish then turned around and himself refused to hire Jewish reporters. When he was accused of being anti-Semitic, he said, "Well, maybe I am." All of this led to the Times' biggest disgrace, burying the Nazi atrocities against Jews. As part of ensuring that the paper wasn't too Jewish, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger enforced a rule specifying that there should be no special pleading for Jewish causes. This included times when there was a reference to Jews being subjected to genocide during the Holocaust. Sulzberger, like Ox, was determined that Jews be viewed as a faith community rather than a nationality. Like Ox, he was a fervent anti-Zionist and insisted that editors not refer to the Jewish people in the Times, but rather to people of the Jewish faith. If a reporter's first name was Abraham, his byline would need to appear only with his initials. Thus it came to pass that during the years that Hitler identified and persecuted Jews as a distinct race, Sulzberger's New York Times insisted that because Jews were not a race, Hitler's persecution of them was not a Jewish problem, but the problem of mankind, as a 1939 editorial put it. The Times identified Jews on the front page as Hitler's target just 6 times between 1939 and 1945. Instead of covering the Holocaust, the Times wrote article after article critical of right-wing Zionists. As Zionism was growing in popularity at the beginning of the 20th century, the Times gave outsized coverage to marginal anti-Zionist voices, reprinting articles that accused the Zionists of playing into the hands of the enemies of their race. But more often, the Times would print editorials and columns arguing what its publisher believed, that the whole idea of a Jewish state was based on the false premise that the Jews are a nation. Judaism was a religion, Ox and later Sulzberger would insist. And as a college professor put it in an article in the Times in 1917, if Judaism is so far gone that its salvation lies in becoming a little state, it had much better die. The Times also routinely blamed Jews for any violence that erupted in what was then Palestine, including when the victims of the violence were Jews. Committed to an anti-Zionist stance, the idea that Jews just did not belong in Palestine deeply influenced the news coverage, which cast the Jews as the oppressors whenever it could. After a brutal attack in the city of Hebron in 1929, in which 69 Jews were savagely murdered, Ox wrote that he was not surprised. Identifying himself as obsessively anti-Zionist, the New York Times publisher, in language that would fit right in with today's woke left, blamed the Zionists for trying to superimpose an aggressive minority in Arabia. that would lead not just to more massacres in Palestine, but to danger to Jews throughout the world. Meanwhile, the Times' correspondent in Palestine had struck up a friendship with the Grand Mufti, something he did not disclose to his readers, who repeatedly wrote in to complain that he was confusing political with repertorial work. And in 1937, after Jewish merchants in Germany had their businesses taken away from them and were prohibited from working in any office in the country, a year after Jewish doctors were prohibited from practicing medicine throughout Germany, and the year of a ritual murder trial of 5 Jews, a Times editorial argued for placing restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine to just a few thousand a year. The Times' discomfort with the Jewish state would never be resolved. It would only assume new forms. In each case, the paper cast Jews and later Israel as powerful instigators against disempowered, agentless Palestinians whom it portrayed as their victims. This was and remains true both when the criticism of Israel is justified, as in discussions of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and blockade of Gaza, and when it is not, as when Israelis are the victims of terrorism or the victims of mob attack. To close readers of the Times' coverage, there is an unmistakable cast to the reporting, as subtle but significant as an Instagram filter. It paints Jews as the agents of aggression and Palestinians as their victims. This is critical race theory's calling card, the Hegelian master-slave dialectic retrofitted from an American context in which race is the stuff used by white people to oppress people of color. And it goes far beyond Israel. According to the view of the intersectional left, Jews are white, and their status as racist members of the oppressor class is emphasized whenever they express outrage at anti-Semitism coming from communities of color. Thus, when a black Muslim congresswoman tweeted an anti-Semitic canard, people who criticized her were accused of racism and Islamophobia. When a Hebrew Israelite shot and killed people working and shopping in a kosher supermarket in New Jersey, the woke left wrote op-eds and editorials blaming Jews for gentrification. When it was revealed that the leaders of the Women's March had trafficked in anti-Semitic canards, mortified liberal Jews were accused of a lack of solidarity. In effect, white Jews, of which I am one, too often see anti-Semitism in what is really the legitimate anger and despair of black people at being dehumanized and marginalized by a social and economic system made for and perpetuated by white people, of which Jewish Americans have indisputably become much more a part than black Americans, as one activist put it in 2019. The binary of the anti-racist worldview erases the complex position in which Jews find themselves in the 21st century, certainly in possession of some amount of privilege and yet still under threat from vicious anti-Semites on both sides of the political spectrum. It's not surprising. Jewish history has, from its inception, defied easy categorization, especially when it comes to power. But to those under the sway of critical race theory, these complexities are invisible. And just as the woke left views America not as flawed, but as totally irredeemable, so too does it view Israel. According to them, the Jewish state's founding did not include tragedy for the Palestinians that can and should be addressed. The founding was completely indefensible and illegitimate. Just as the 1619 Project sought to redefine America as being built on racism, its true founding the day the first African slave was brought to the United States, so too are we told by activists that Zionism, the belief that Jews require a state to protect them from the malevolent forces that seek their destruction, is not a form of self-determination for them, it's racism. Though the conflict between Israeli Jews and Palestinians is not a racial one at all, but a national one in which two peoples are fighting over a national border. And though the majority of Israel's Jewish citizens are Jews of color, the woke left and the media outlets catering to them see only oppressors and oppressed, racists and their victims. But it's not just Israel and Zionism that suffer from the left's inaccurate and immature woke double vision. We have seen wokeness at play in the coverage of Orthodox Jews in recent years. For much of 2018 and 2019, Orthodox Jews in the greater New York area were subject to a constant barrage of assaults. Hasidic and Orthodox Jewish people were attacked on the streets of Brooklyn almost daily in assaults that ranged from spitting to punching to someone being hit in the face with a brick to Hasidic women having their wigs pulled off in public. Video of the attacks would frequently be caught on camera and circulated on social media. 2/3 of the attacks were committed by juveniles who are local residents of Brooklyn, according to the police. But though there were close to 100 attacks on Jews in 2019 in the United States, not one major media outlet covered them until it broke out into actual mass murder, first in Jersey City, where a gunman opened fire in a kosher supermarket, and then in Muncie, New York, where a mentally ill man wielding a machete stormed a Hanukkah celebration. For all of 2019, it was like the Orthodox community was invisible. Until the coronavirus. The virus initially hit Orthodox Jews hard for many of the same reasons it hit immigrant communities hard. Both of these communities are tight-knit, somewhat insular and isolated, live in small and crowded apartments, and attend religious services in packed spaces. By late March of 2020, before the public schools had even closed, the Orthodox community was in the midst of a full-on plague. And because the national news media saw that they could cast the Jews as the villains of the virus instead of its victims, they suddenly couldn't get enough of them. Every outlet began running pieces about the Orthodox, often full of inaccuracies, blaming Orthodox recalcitrants in social distancing or mask wearing for spreading the virus, not just among their own communities, but to their neighbors too. You couldn't scroll through Twitter for 10 seconds without landing on a story denouncing Orthodox Jews for spreading the coronavirus. Now that the Jews could be cast as the perpetrators rather than the victims, the woke media went into hyperdrive. If the working classes have been the greatest victims of the media's racial moral panic, the Jews have been a close second. And as America's intelligentsia has abandoned the American dream for an invisible but utterly rigid and uncrossable class divide, it's no surprise that Jews, famous for not fitting neatly into categories and for disrupting class stratification, have been subject to rising antipathy from the ruling class. Crime. Another area of news coverage that's fallen prey to the woke culture war at the expense of the poor and working classes is crime. For the great populist journalists of American history, Benjamin Day and Joseph Pulitzer, crime coverage was crucial. In their quest to court poor and working class readers, they knew they had to become storytellers, and crime makes for a good story, with its built-in narrative arc, its villains and victims. But more importantly, they wanted to give their readers local news to read, news that reflected their lived realities. And for the poor and working classes, crime all too often is local news. Unlike the New York Times reader, whose life is protected from petty theft and murder, huge swaths of Americans live lives that are constantly upended by crime. Moving away from crime was a conscious decision many newspapers made in the 1960s in order to cater to a more affluent readership, as Matthew Pressman found in his book on press. Newspapers must throw away all definitions of what makes news, petty crime, local fires, the chit-chat which provided so much of the stuff of our father's newspaper, said the Times' executive editor in a 1965 speech. Or, as the Arizona Republic put it in 1961, less crime and catastrophe that is like all the other crime and catastrophe. Local news does continue to cover crime, though often in problematic ways. There has been a consistent problem in how Black Americans are represented in the media when it comes to crime. A 2014 study by the Sentencing Project found that Black suspects often go unnamed and are more likely to be presented in a threatening manner or pictured in the custody of the police than white suspects. The study also found that white Americans overestimate how much crime is committed by people of color, believing that Black Americans are responsible for 20 to 30% more crime than they actually commit, thanks in part to media depictions. Television news programs and newspapers overrepresent racial minorities as crime suspects and whites as crime victims, the study found. A 1992 study in Journalism Quarterly found something similar, that crime and political coverage on television depict Blacks in crime as more physically threatening and in politics as more demanding than comparable white activists or leaders. Another study out of Columbus found that though the city's murders were predominantly committed by and against Black men, journalists gravitated to unusual cases when selecting victims, white women, and to typical cases when selecting perpetrators, Black men. And in addition to these instances of unconscious bias, there have been overt attempts at outlets like Breitbart, which explicitly and proudly cater to the alt-right, to associate Black Americans and immigrants with crime. Breitbart routinely and misleadingly associates people of color with crime, including Muslims, undocumented immigrants, and Black Americans. For years, it had a tag that allowed the staff to label stories as Black crime. And bad actors too often pose the question, what about Black on Black crime, to take the attention off of an important issue at hand like police brutality and deflect it back to Black people, long a problematic trope on the right. But as with so much of what's been chronicled in this book, a necessary correction has resulted in an overcorrection. The only stories about crime the New York Times seems interested in running are about the 1994 crime bill that Joe Biden pushed for, and those about popular true crime podcasts. There is an absolute dearth of reporting on crime as it affects poor and working class Americans, something that's become all the more stark in the context of the upticks in violence and murder that have happened in cities across America during the COVID-19 lockdown. Cities across the country like New York, Chicago, and St. Louis have seen a massive increase in gun violence, domestic violence, and murder. The victims of this violence are largely people of color, African Americans and Latinos, but you almost never hear about it in the national mainstream media. Instead of crime coverage, we get extensive coverage of police brutality, especially when the police kill a person of color. Even before Derek Chauvin's trial for the murder of George Floyd began, the New York Times had run over 4,000 articles mentioning Floyd, compared to just 4 articles about Tony Timpa, the white man who was killed by police in exactly the same manner as Floyd. And Timpa's 4 articles make up 3 more articles than there are for Sincere Gaston and Natalia Wallace, children murdered during the summer of 2020, who in turn got 1 more mention than DeJour Wilson, Janari Ricks, and Lena Nunez Anaya, whose names do not appear at all. These children, some as young as 20 months old, died in the summer of 2020 as a result of gun violence, and yet their names never made it into the mainstream press. Their deaths just didn't fit the narrative. This is not to say we shouldn't be focused on police brutality. We should be very focused on it. It should appall us, and we should demand reform. There is no comparing an agent of the state committing a crime or killing or harming a person they have been charged with protecting with a private citizen committing a crime. In fact, these things are inversely related, as Jill Leovy found in her excellent book, Ghetto-Side, A True Story of Murder in America. Over-policing misdemeanors leads directly to an inability to solve violent crime and even murder in minority communities. But while police brutality should absolutely be a priority for the national news media, the taboo on covering crime means it will continue unabated. Woke ideology has a certain narrative and script, and it's pushing everything else to the side in terms of the way that it dominates the political narrative, said Zed Jelani, a journalist who has been writing about the left and identity politics for years. There were massive amounts of bloodshed all over the country this summer, and the political left organized no response to this because it didn't fit into their narrative. It wasn't violence committed by white cops against people of color, but rather violence within minority communities. They couldn't easily pin this on Trump or the reactionary right or white supremacy because it didn't fit their narrative, it didn't appear on their radar, despite the fact that we have thousands of people who died this year, Jelani said. It's not just that inner city violence isn't on the left's radar. There's an absolute taboo around bringing it up. This taboo was on full display in another episode that took place during the spring of 2020. A reporter for The Intercept, Lee Fang, interviewed a young black man at a Black Lives Matter rally who mentioned how much he wished protesters cared more about inner city violence and not just police violence. Fang posted the video to his Twitter feed, and in response to the video, a colleague of Fang's at The Intercept called him a racist in a series of tweets shared tens of thousands of times. Fang apologized. Woke ideology crowds out everything that happens that doesn't fit a very niche narrative, Jelani pointed out. I don't think the average person of minority background in the United States is sitting there thinking every day that a white supremacist is the biggest threat to their life. Terrorism is rare in the United States. There are a dozen or so people who are killed in hate crime type incidents. Meanwhile, there are so many homicides every year that it actually widens the black-white life expectancy gap. These persistent problems are just not seen as relevant to the attention of the modern political left, because the political left has a narrative, it has the victims, it has the oppressors, and if it doesn't fit that storyline, it basically doesn't exist, even if the things that don't fit the storyline are much more relevant to the lives of ordinary people, Jelani said. And the media plays a huge role in this. St. Louis had one of its deadliest years in half a century in terms of its homicide rate this past year in 2020. There was barely any attention paid to this on the political left, Jelani said. As he explained, nobody was talking about it. Yet when you had a couple at a Black Lives Matter rally come out into their front yard with guns, it was a silly thing they did, obviously. That was a story the left was very interested in. Democrats were talking about it. Elected officials were talking about it. It became a huge national story. This silly behavior by this couple opposing a Black Lives Matter event that happened to be going on their street. That was the story. The fact that so many young kids were shot to death, many of them just bystanders in these gang wars, not only was it not discussed, I don't think that anyone even thought to look for it. One reason that's commonly given for the increase in coverage of racial issues and the newly woke attitude of the national news media is the proliferation of videos on social media depicting police brutality. As the actor Will Smith put it, racism is not getting worse, it's getting filmed. But for social media to step in and fill that hole, it first had to be created. And it was created by a nationalized media that spurned crime as sensationalism, just as Benjamin Day's critics had. Crime, after all, is a local affair. Someone living in Washington, D.C. is not likely to be very interested in a crime happening in Kenosha, Wisconsin, unless it's big enough to matter to their life or likely to spread. As the mainstream media got nationalized, it by and large left coverage of local crime to local news, unless the crime had national implications or could sustain the public's interest. As the local newspaper industry collapsed, poorer communities became news deserts, places where coverage was simply non-existent, apart from the odd disaster, at which point journalists would helicopter in. Into this lacuna came ordinary citizens with cell phone cameras, recording videos, and posting them to their social media accounts. These citizen journalists could circumvent the media's lack of interest and make people pay attention. And what they captured was the kind of police brutality that is shocking if you live in a nice neighborhood, but is all too familiar to working-class Americans, especially Black Americans. But while the national news media had relegated coverage of crime to local TV stations, it found a big incentive in covering police brutality, which could be neatly fit into the woke worldview its white readers now subscribe to. And like so many other developments chronicled in this book, it created a feedback loop that metastasized. A study published in the journal Political Behavior in September 2020 found that articles and video footage showing police use of force against minority groups elicited a deep emotional response in the studied subjects, significantly increasing the subjects' perceptions of the frequency of the police's use of excessive force by up to 20 percentage points among white liberals and 10 percentage points among white conservatives. But it would be a mistake to believe that the coverage of police brutality functions the way crime coverage did for Pulitzer and Day. Where these earlier publishers covered crime to make poor and working class readers feel seen, today's media covers police shootings to stoke the emotions of wealthy readers and sell their emotions to advertisers. What this has resulted in is a national media that won't report on crime, ignores the murder of hundreds of children and other innocent victims in inner cities, and overcovers police brutality, lionizing its victims whether or not they were themselves armed or even threatening someone else, and turning complicated stories into morality plays of good versus evil. You can't solve a problem you don't know exists. By maintaining a total taboo on talking about crime in minority neighborhoods, we consign the residents there to keep living with it indefinitely, something affluent whites would never in a million years accept as the standard for themselves and their own families. Indeed, it's from their safe, upscale neighborhoods that affluent white liberals read the coverage of police brutality in the New York Times and vocally call for abolishing the police. Trump's voters. Few things expose the disconnect between woke media and reality like the exit polls of the 2020 election. The liberal news media had spent the election writing with gusto about Trump's white nationalist ties, his calls to the Proud Boys to stand by, the disastrous family separation policy, and other things that supposedly proved how he was the apotheosis of white supremacy. And yet, when the time came to pull the lever, the only group Trump lost ground with was white men. Women, members of the LGBTQ community, Asians, blacks, Latinos, and even Muslims all turned out for Trump in 2020 in significantly higher numbers than they had in 2016. He increased his support with black men, getting a record 18% of their vote, despite his racist statements about backward countries and an inability to disavow white nationalists. He got nearly 40% of the Latino vote, despite calling Mexicans rapists. He got 35% of the Muslim vote, despite a Muslim ban. And he drew support from LGBTQ folks despite rolling back protections for transgender Americans. This revealed in the starkest terms not only the liberal news media's lack of power to persuade, but its failure to correctly analyze and even understand the America that stands before it. And in a large part, this stems from a woke worldview that casts white Americans as privileged upholders of white supremacy and people of color as their victims. When large amounts of people of color rejected that view, choosing the person whom the press cast as the apotheosis of white supremacy, it literally didn't compute. You saw this clearly in the public breakdown of a New York Times columnist who produced a series of tortured tweets about Trump's minority support, ultimately writing a Times op-ed piece in which he argued that some people who have historically been oppressed will stand with the oppressors and will aspire to power by proximity. It must have just been easier for him to call nearly 40% of Latinos white supremacists than it would have been for him to accept that his whole worldview was wrong. It was certainly easier than confronting the alternative, that the mainstream national liberal media has no idea who these people are or what motivates them, and cannot comprehend a voter from a minority community who might care about something more than how a president might express himself. A lot of what the media and the front row obsess over, language, style, etiquette, are just not that important to the back row, the author Chris Arnaudy explained to me. They tend to be more forgiving and to judge people by their behavior, not their words. There is also a tendency for the working class to be more blunt, which puts them on the wrong side of the language barrier erected by the college-educated. There is an entirely different language that the front row uses that often drifts into political correctness that is learned in colleges and universities. By making using any language other than that profane, it ultimately is a way to silence the working class from having a say in these discussions, Arnaudy argued. The national liberal media, enthralled to wokeness, was no better at understanding Trump's white voters, or rural and poor whites in general. In fact, what many people are describing when talking about whiteness is a form of class privilege that's miscast through a racial lens. Of course, race is still a factor in American life. Statistics show that there are areas where Black Americans are still treated differently than white Americans. Studies have consistently shown that while it is not true that blacks are killed by the police at a rate higher than whites, they are insulted more, manhandled more, and brutalized more than whites. The police pull them over more while driving, and judges give Black Americans longer sentences than they give white Americans for the same crimes on average. Other studies have shown that white-sounding names garner more interviews for job applicants than Black and Asian-sounding names, and certainly the legacy of redlining persists in the Black-white wealth gap. But, as Nancy Eisenberg has shown, many of the discriminatory behaviors we associate with racism have historically plagued poor whites too. In the colonial era, while only Black slaves were treated as chattel, most of the rest of the population were not free either. Most of the colonial population fell into the unfree classes of apprentices, servants, convict laborers, sailors impressed into service, landless poor, and slaves. Married women were civilly dead under the British common law, denied the right to own property. They were, like children, dependents, writes Eisenberg in an essay in The American Scholar. Before the 1920s, the color line was, at best, erratically maintained, and people relied on things like wealth, status, class, and their markers to display privilege of different kinds that transcended race. Moreover, the term segregation has not only been used to describe the separation between white and black Americans in the early 20th century. Eisenberg discovered that it was also used to describe the separation of lower status whites from better whites, and even the pursuit of eugenics and sterilization policies against whites with low IQs. For many in the early 20th century, writes Eisenberg in her book White Trash, the new race problem was caused by the worthless class of antisocial whites. Both black and white convicts were routinely referred to by the N-word, and there were segregation and discrimination against poor whites as well as black people seeking mortgages and business loans. The suburbs, for example, were zoned to keep out lower-class families. As Eisenberg found, segregation was more than simply a racial issue. Zoning laws made it inevitable that housing would adhere to a class-delineated geography. The working class had its bowling alleys and diners, and white trash its trailer park slums, both of which contrasted sharply with the backyard barbecues of all-white neighborhoods in favored suburbs zoned for the middle class. While these policies may no longer be in effect, the worldview they reflect, one that views poor, less intelligent, and uneducated Americans as beyond salvation, irredeemable, and filled with hate, is one that is still familiar to us. It's how many in the media still view poor whites and to some degree the working class. There is a lot of contempt and even disgust for the working class aesthetic and culture associated with people who haven't gone to college. And that contempt is all too often clothed as anti-racism, when what it actually reflects is a liberal culture increasingly separated from the things that give the have-nots dignity: religion, family, country, home. As Connor Friedersdorf told me, people on the left don't understand that all the talk of white privilege is very easy to hear if you're a white person who's doing well, and impossibly grating to hear if you are a white person who is struggling at the edge of poverty and effectively being told that not only have you failed in life, but it was entirely your fault because you were playing on the easiest setting and you still failed. Of course, that demographic doesn't vote for Democrats because that's what they hear from Democrats. As Eisenberg put it, whiteness is not a privilege equally enjoyed by all white Americans. There is more in common between the white working class and the black and Latino working class than either has in common with the front row credentialed class. And yet, at the political level, there is a division, Arnade explained. It benefits the elites of both parties to keep it that way, to use segments of the working class as soldiers, voters, or tokens for their political and cultural battles between themselves. I am not dismissing the racism and distrust that exists in the working class, but believe it is magnified cynically as a political tool.
And that was Chapter 10, Case Studies, from Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy by Badia Unger Sargon. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.